The Secret Library podcast is brought to you in part by our kick-ass Patreon supporters. If you'd like to join the group and get bonus audio content from me every month, as well at certain levels, for the chance to contribute questions for a Q&A audio, you can check it out at patreon.com/secretlibrary. This is episode 3 of the Secret Library podcast. My guest this week is the amazing Chip Cheek, author of the novel Cape May. Those of you who've been listening to the show for a while will remember Chip from our previous very, very long first season. And one of the things that you'll remember is that he had an incredible first draft story, which is that he wasn't sure what time period he wanted to set his novel in. So he went through, and for each chapter, he wrote it in a completely different time period, which I thought was one of the coolest and most fun first draft stories I had heard. All of you agreed with me. I got a ton of feedback about how much you enjoyed hearing the Chip episode. And I knew when we were going to talk about revision that I was dying to go back and talk to him again and learn how he took this first draft that was set in as many time periods as there were chapters and went back to revise it again. One of the other noteworthy things about his first draft was he said it was such an incredibly joyful experience. And he had worked on several novels before this that felt like a drudge. They felt really like a grind to get through. But something about really letting this book happen in such a free, uninhibited way was one of the happiest periods of writing that he had had. You can go back and listen to the first episode to hear more about this, but I wanted us all to be on the same page when we started this interview and this conversation, where we dive back in where we left off with Chip, which is the end of his first draft. And now we're going to look forward at how he revised this amazing novel and had Cape May at the end. So here we go with Chip Cheek. Hey, Chip, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me back.
Yes, your book was a big success with the readers. Everybody tells me how much they love it, and everyone is fascinated by the process you went through writing the first draft with each chapter or section in a different era, figuring out which era the book was meant to be in. So I was like, oh, if we're talking about revision, I got to talk to Chip again. So
absolutely. Yeah.
You were starting to say something about revision when I said, my goodness, we must start recording. So right. I want to bring you back to that thought if it's still there.
Sure. Well, I was just going to say that, for me, revision is not necessarily separate from writing. I honestly don't even think of it as its own category. Revision is writing. The process of writing is revision. It's almost entirely revision. I don't really think of it in terms of you write a draft and then you revise the draft and then it's over. Typically, it's writing, rewriting, and it's 90% of the time is what you're doing is rewriting the thing and figuring out, problems. It's like this huge problem you have to solve. So, I mean, that's just what I was going to say. That just as a general thing for my process. This book, though, was a little bit different in that we'd mentioned the last time we talked. I wrote this book in a fever and did this first draft in 2 months and didn't look back. And as I was writing, I wasn't looking back. I was just kind of in the moment with the story until I arrived at the end. So with this one, I did kind of, I had a first draft and it was a complete train wreck, but it was a train wreck I loved. And I said, okay, what do I do with this now? So with this, it was a little bit different, but that was 2 months of writing, and then for the next year and a half, 2 years, it was revising. But that's what I think of as writing.
So what did you have in place at the end of those 2 months? And can you say more about why it was a train wreck, maybe?
Well, it was a train wreck just in the sense that I was playing with time periods. Like, it started in the 20s, it started in the first person. By the time I was done with the draft, it was in some time like the 50s, maybe some indeterminate time, and it was in the third person, and in the middle of all of that, I was playing with all these different time periods as I was going, and I wasn't really focused much on the sentence level stuff, which is a kind of a departure for me. I've always been very careful with my sentences, but with this first draft, I wasn't really polishing the sentences as I went, which is in other words, I was doing it the right way. Like, you shouldn't be worried about the sentence level stuff when you're doing the first draft. And I think maybe it took years for me to finally get that through my head. But it was a train wreck in the sense of not all the sentences were pretty. It was like different points of view. It was, all this stuff. But what's kind of amazing though is that first draft though did have all the big moves of the plot, and the characters were all there in that first draft. What happens in the first draft in terms of the story is very much what is there in the final draft of the book. And that was just, I don't know if that's just blind luck or what.
Maybe because you weren't holding so tightly to the other aspects of it, that one stuck.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I was in the moment, focused on the story, focused on what's going to happen with these characters, and the words weren't there. It was like I was seeing, through the words. I felt so in the story, and I think that's part of why, like when I was revising the book, it was. I wanted to preserve that feeling, that immediacy, and that thrill that I felt when I was writing the first draft.
I think that's one of the hardest things about revision is how do you preserve the kind of feeling and atmosphere of this. You want people to feel like you sat down and wrote the thing from start to finish, which I don't think anyone has ever done, but that there's this feeling of freshness and immediacy, and yet it's been worked over dozens of times. So how do you hold those two things, those two concepts together as you're working?
Yeah, honestly, I don't know. I had, as I was writing the first draft, there was, so I wrote the first draft during the summer after my wife and I got married. It was a summer where we were going to the beach pretty much every weekend. We were living in Boston at the time, in Somerville, just outside of Boston, and we were going to the beach every weekend. And it was a really thrilling summer just in our lives. Like, we were newly married, we had our new apartment, and there was music that I was listening to as I was writing that first draft. There was certain songs that were in my head. There was a TV show we were binge watching at the time. I'm not embarrassed to say what it was.
What was it?
It was the awesome television show Pretty Little Liars.
Oh my God, amazing.
The first season of which is absolute gold. And we were watching the first season or two of that as I was writing this book. And I was also reading for the first time Donna Tartt's The Secret History.
Oh, so good.
Yeah, which blew my mind. In The Secret History, there's something of that got into this book. And so, I think in the couple of years that followed, as I was revising it, all I had to do is close my eyes, hear the music, listen, and it's music that has nothing to do with the 50s, right? I mean, one of the songs was this, it was a song by Young Galaxy, and I can't remember the name of the song. Pretty Boy by Young Galaxy. There was also this orchestral piece by, it's the Voltiva is the name of it, and I'm going to mess up the pronunciation of the name. It's Biedrich Smetana. I don't know if that's how you pronounce the name, but it's a piece called the Voltiva, and it's gorgeous, and it was in my head. It's kind of almost like the soundtrack of Cape May in my head.
Cool.
And all I had to do is close my eyes, hear that music, think of Pretty Little Liars and Donna Tartt, and that summer we went to the beach, and I was there. You know what I mean? Like, it brought me back to the thrill, and also certain scenes. There are certain scenes in the book that were just cornerstone scenes for me. There's a scene in which Henry and Effie have just started, their inhibitions are starting to fall away, and they have just made love on the back deck of their house and of the place they're staying in, and it's the middle of the night, and they have no clothes on, and they decide to walk around the neighborhood in the moonlight. It's a simple, it's a little thrilling scene, but it's just, there's something about that scene that, like, the DNA of the book is in that scene. And so, yeah, I think I could just through like scenes like that, through music, through just the memories of where I was when I was in the first throes of writing this book. I think I could always access it. Those were my doors into the feeling. I don't know if that makes any sense or if that's helpful.
It absolutely does. I mean, I think there are. I find that there are different pieces of music that I have to listen to when I'm writing at different points. And that there's different stuff that just sort of taps into it. And like you said, it isn't necessarily music from the time period. In fact, it frequently isn't.
Right.
So you got to the end of the draft and you knew what happened, but the sentences weren't completely sorted out. How did you start
Yeah.
to attack that? And then, or maybe attack is too strong a word. How did you start to smooth it out and work with it over the next year and a half to get it to a place where you were happy?
Sure. It was a lot more than just the sentences that was, the issue. So I'll just kind of tell you just kind of briefly what my process was.
Yes, please.
So I finished the first draft. I printed it out. I think it was actually 299 pages, manuscript pages. And I printed it. I printed it out. I spent the next week or so sitting in an armchair. Well, I mean, I had a job, the way I was able to write this book was I had a job that the hours were from 1 to 6. So I would write in the morning. And so I had I could get up early in the morning and write all morning and then go into my job. So it wasn't like this is the only thing I had to do, but I would get up each morning, sit in this armchair, have my little manuscript, and I read the entire thing through with a pen and marked it up in terms of just like themes, little motifs that seemed to appear. In other words, I was reading to see what I had done. I wasn't sure, I wrote it so quickly that I wasn't even sure what was there. And so I read it to sort of see what I had done. Then I read it again more quickly with a legal pad next to me, and I made an outline based on what I'd already written. In other words, I created an outline, not first, but after I'd written the first draft. So I wrote the first draft, and then I made an outline that gave me a glance, that would be able to give me a glance at what I had done. And that outline was, what sort of happened, in each chapter. In the chapters at that point were kind of arbitrary. And I wrote, I would note like little images that seemed to recur and come back, things that, were in, sort of subconsciously were working, but I wasn't aware of them until I sort of read through it with fresh eyes and was able to see, oh my God, there's a lot of imagery here about like things transforming. There's a lot of imagery about tidal forces, whether it's the waves or whatever, or the moon and stuff. And by the end of that, I had a marked up manuscript and I had say 10 pages of legal paper that was a working outline of the book and something that I could see, here's what it was. So I sat with that for about 5 months. And the first question that I really struggled over was what the time period was.
Right.
Because that is, because here's the story, here's what it was. And then I really was like, when are we going to set this thing? And I struggled with this so much that it was almost to the point of despair. I was like, it could take place in any time. In a way, the story is they're off in their own little world. They're sort of like they've left the normal world and gone to this other place where rules don't apply, and it's sort of sealed off from reality. So in a way, it could take place in any time. But ultimately, I settled on the 50s, and the 50s, I settled on it not by myself. I settled on it with the help of my writing group. So what finally happened is after about 5-6 months of struggling with this question, I polished up a few pages, representative pages, to show to my writing group, and I brought it into them and asked them, when do you think this is set? What does it make sense?
So you just said, what does it feel like?
Exactly. Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And the consensus was around the 50s. This feels like the 50s. And we talked it through, and the reason it was just the right time period that was right is because what happens in the story, the action of the story, if it were set too much earlier than the 50s, it wouldn't feel plausible very much. But if it were set too much later, the action would lose its charge. Like if Cape May were set now, it's like, who cares?
It's like reality show heaven now. Plus, they wouldn't be so cut off because of technology and social media.
Exactly. Right. There's no way you could unless all the cell phone towers were destroyed or something. It's a post-apocalyptic landscape. There's no way it could be set in but it took a long time for me to realize that. Like what looks now, it's so funny. You see the marketing copy on the book now. It's like this exploration of the mores of the 50s or whatever they say, and I'm like, that's so funny because it looks like it was totally intentional, but it wasn't at all. Like I had the story first, and then figured out what the time period should be, and then by the magic of revision made it seem like that's what I had intended all along.
I think it's so interesting that you were reading Donna Tartt's The Secret History
Yeah.
while working on this, because one of the things that I love about that book, and I can see that happening in Cape May as well, is that I know when she was at Bennington. And obviously this book isn't supposed to be
Hmm.
autobiographical, but
Yeah.
there's a sense of atmosphere I think that one takes with
Right.
you after you leave a small liberal arts college. And yet her book has always felt to me like it was in the 50s, even though there's absolutely no indicator of when
Right.
it's happening.
That's right. That's
I've
right. That's
looked
so
for it
interesting.
too in that book. I'm like, when does she says anything, but she doesn't name cars. She doesn't name brands. She doesn't name clothing. She doesn't even really go into style at all. But there's
Right.
something of the atmosphere that
Hmm.
that came through. So I could see that translating over if you were reading it that summer.
Yes, yes, that's absolutely true. And when people would ask me what I was working on, I would say it's as if I'm working on a book that would be as if James Salter wrote The Secret History. That's how I would describe it to people.
That's
Even
funny.
though, that ultimately doesn't really, that's not, that doesn't describe Kate May at all, but on a sort of like deep level, it's true. That was another, that description itself was another way I was able to access the thrill of the book, even after, even when I was in the trenches of revision.
So what kinds of things you were looking at leitmotifs, you were looking at the era. So once you got through and you decided after 5 months that you
Hmm.
knew when it was set, was that the next thing you went back
Yeah.
through and worked through?
Yeah. So when I knew what time period it was, I put the draft to the side and opened up a new document and began rewriting it. And so I started with chapter one, and so then it became figuring out how to open the story. The first draft actually opens with their wedding in
Interesting.
Georgia, and I knew it couldn't start there. So it was kind of quickly became clear to me that it had to start with their arrival at Cape May, and so I struggled with how to make that happen. And I really, I spent maybe a year, if not more, on just the first three chapters. I would say, just struggling over those three chapters, but the opening. But in struggling with that, I was figuring out the kind of tone. I was figuring out the point of view. I was making a decision on the point of view. I still wasn't sure if it should be in first and third or third, but I quickly realized it had to be in third person. And I realized it had to be, I figured out what the sort of the feel of the voice would be, all through working through those first three chapters. And I was also, the secret history. It's funny. It's still. It really was an influence, mostly positive. There was a negative side to it though too, because I struggled for a while thinking that there wasn't enough story in the story. I kept thinking that there needed to be, in the same way that the narrator of the secret history encounters this group of people who have these secrets,
Yeah.
and they have this really involved, thing going on with them. In the same way, I thought Henry and Effie, they encounter these people, and I thought there wasn't enough with those people. Like there needed to be more story to them, and so I struggled for a while with like what's their backstory, and this idea that there needed to be some secret to them, in the same way that was in the secret history. And it took me a long time to realize that that's not what was important in the story, and that wasn't necessary at all. That their backstory they didn't have to be sort of like this Byzantine, thing going on between them. That it was just, the focus wasn't there. So I struggled with that and kind of figuring out where the story was, and realizing that the focus of the story is on it's Henry and Effie, it's their marriage, it's a story ultimately about their marriage and their relationship. And yeah, so it was a lot of just like, it wasn't intentional, like I'm working and I know what I'm doing all the time. I was waking up every day and thinking like I'm never going to get done with this. I remember after about a year of this thinking like, in only having two or three chapters, thinking, and I would go to five chapters and they realized they were wrong and cut those off and start again and all that. And I remember thinking like, I can't do this. Like I lack a certain gene that allows people like my friends can finish books, but I can't finish
Oh my
books.
God. If I had
Like
a
I'm just
dollar for
not
every
capable.
time I thought that one.
No, exactly. So it wasn't, so I don't want to give the impression that I was knew what I was doing. I had no idea what I was doing. But in retrospect, I see that it was all very necessary work. And I finally had these good chapters that I really, really liked. And then that's when Katie got pregnant and we knew we were going to have a kid. And I finished the rest of the book in 9 months.
Wow.
Once that deadline happened, I will say and it was the first three chapters I had from that point on. I wrote that book in 9 months. I wrote the rest of it, but I think it's because I had done that work. I had done the work of really knowing the voice, really knowing the characters, making a bunch of false starts, and understanding what the book was and where I wanted to go. Even if I was struggling with it consciously, and maybe if you had asked me at the time, how do you feel about your book? I'd be like, it's terrible. I'm never going to finish it. Once the baby was on the way, and I was like, I'm not going to not finish this. I'm going to finish this book. There's no question, and I just did it.
I think that's the hardest
It's like
part.
it's like
It's like, it seems like there's this pattern that everyone goes through. It's like there's an initial impulse, you get something down, then you start going in to wrestle with it. And there's a point where it feels like this is never going to work. And that's the
yeah,
point when a lot of people walk away and they think, I'm not meant to do this. This is a
exactly.
bad idea. There's no way to fix this. And so I'm interested
hmm
in what kept you engaged at the point when you felt like, I'm never going to finish this book.
Well, I think for me it's process. Like I am not a person who is motivated by X amount of words or pages per day. I'm very much into the idea of this is writing as a way of life, and I'm just going. It's a job, and I put in the time each day. And so this was my project. And so each morning, what was important to me is not how much I completed in a day, but that I had got to my desk at 7 in the morning and was dutifully working until it was time to go to my day job. And that's what kept me going. I think on a day to day level, was that this is what I do. And I had two failed novel attempts before this. Where I'd spent a couple of years grinding away on stories that never went anywhere until when I finally discovered Cape May. And so, but even through that all, I never just despaired, really. I mean, I would just show up and do my work each day. But there was something about Cape May that felt different, and I think it had to do with just the way that first draft came out of me and the way I didn't think about it too much. I wasn't over intellectualizing it or whatever, over analyzing it. It just happened, and I loved that first draft so much that even though I might say I lack whatever gene it is to like finish a book, I always knew that this is good. Like I knew that if I had that gene and I could finish this book, it would be awesome. Like I felt confident about it, and that's not how I felt about previous novel attempts. I felt I really didn't know what I was doing. But there's something about how this book came into being on a kind of, I don't know, like I don't know how to describe it. It just wasn't. I didn't think this thing into being. I kind of like just it was exciting, right? It felt like I don't want to say cheesy things like it came to me, or like I had nothing. Because that's nonsense. Obviously, I did it, but it was just so. I just didn't. It was some. I wrote from a place of just pure like excitement and interest and thrill, as opposed to like let me analyze this story as a great artist. Let me like create this. I don't know how to say what I'm saying, but like. The way it came into being felt different, and I knew it was something different, and I knew that it was something that was going to get done somehow or another.
No is a good answer. And I think it brings something up also that I think is important. And I'm wondering, because I have also ground away at novels previously for years and then set them aside
Mhm.
because it didn't feel like it was working. And I wonder
Yeah.
now, handling the current book differently. Because the way you're talking about the way you were
hmm
holding it in your mind, that you weren't over analyzing it and you weren't trying to think about it like a great
hmm
artist, which I think is a great way to describe what
hmm
happens. Um, do you think
hmm
that the ideas themselves weren't good, or was it because you were treating them in that fashion that they couldn't happen?
Yeah, I think that they were. For me, I think it was because I was thinking of them as ideas. I think some writers can write like that, like and many do. Many write from maybe a political impetus, or they write because they want to convey some idea. Obviously, some great writers do that, but it's not how I operate, and I think it took me a while to understand that for myself. The previous novel attempts had to do, with ideas that I am, and continue to be very interested in, but they weren't gaining traction because I wasn't feeling them on a character story level. I wasn't able to translate that idea to the visceral character level. I think with this novel, it felt like I remember telling people that the characters don't stand for anything, they don't mean anything, and there was something significant about that. Of course, they do mean something. Of course, they do, at the end of the day, stand for something. But when I was writing them, Henry and Effie don't represent any. As I was writing it, they didn't represent anything but themselves. They were just Henry and Effie. This story wasn't trying to say anything other than what it was, and there was something about that was refreshing, that felt right. I didn't want to think about what they meant, and I feel like that's, after finishing the book, I could then look back and think of them as, of course, they are certain kinds of people in a certain context and time period, and I could write an essay about that and talk very smartly about that and probably impressively about what I was trying to do, but it would be a lie. That's not it. They were just Henry and Effie, and that allowed me to write the book. It freed me. I think in a way it felt very liberating.
Definitely.
Um, and I think when you don't think too hard about what you're doing in a weird way, you're able to access things that you could not have thought of directly that may surprise you. It's if you hold it, just if you kind of hold the object a little to your peripheral vision, try not to stare too directly at it and proceed with instinct, you're going to surprise yourself. And if you surprise yourself, you're going to surprise your reader. And maybe you're going to unearth things about you, subterranean things that you can't consciously say this about yourself, but by writing in this way where you're trying to not look too closely at it, you may reveal things inside you that are very raw, that are very oh, whoa, yes, this feels very real,
Yes.
Yeah. And I think I only want to write that way from now on.
Of course.
And I realize that's why I love fiction. That's what fiction can do, that I can't do with writing an expository essay.
No, I think that's so important because I think that there's such importance placed on doing things, quote, consciously, or being aware of doing them while they're happening. And that, you have to trust yourself and to trust that the intention will come through underneath, even if you don't have it point by point in a little outline next to you as you're writing.
Right. Right.
I think that trust is a huge part of it, and that you have to believe that it's okay to just write a story about Henry and Effie, and that there is a reason for that, and the fact that you want to write that story, that there's something else going on underneath, and it's okay if you don't know at the beginning.
Yeah, I think that's very wise. Yep, that's very true. Yeah, trust. I like that.
Of course, you all don't have to name your characters Henry and Effie for this to work. They can have other names.
They can have. Yeah.
There's going to be a lot of books coming out now with Henry and Effie in them.
Yeah, no, you don't have to do that. Yeah. I wished I'd named the character. So Henry came from a previous novel, one of the failed previous novels I was writing. And Henry is my name. Henry, I'm Chip Cheek, but my legal name is Henry Cheek. It's also my father's name. And in the previous book, I just, it was set in the 1920s, and it's this character, and I was like, what should this character be named? I'm just going to call him Henry because it's, writing novels is hard, and this character is essentially just going to be, who I might have been if I was born in this time period. And so I don't have to sort of reinvent a character from the ground up. And then once he kind of transferred over into Cape May, I realized, I was like, crap, no, I really have to change this name. I don't want to be associated, with this. But it was too late. He was just Henry. I tried I tried different names, but it just didn't work. And so, it's funny. I have to I feel like I would have to tell the publisher, like, write the checks or tax stuff, they'd be like Chip Cheek. I'd be like, oh no, actually it's Henry.
And no, it's not about
but it
me.
has nothing to do with the book. That'd have to be, it's not based on anything, it's also not based on my dad, for Christ's sake.
Oh man. I know, that's always intense.
Oh.
That is so, the naming of characters is so tricky. And you don't want a name to get sticky if you're just using it as a placeholder.
Yeah. That's what happened though.
Yeah. I have one I'm afraid that's happening too. And I got to change it real soon because I'm afraid it's going to get stuck.
Well, it's okay. It's all right. If it works, it works.
Yeah, so the problem with the sticky name thing is that I chose this name. I knew it was going to be a placeholder in the book, and then I ended up with a student with the same name. So I felt like it wasn't even the right name. And plus, this student is a completely different person than the character. Like, they're not. Yeah. And then it was starting to confuse me because I was like, am I thinking that they're the same? But they're really not the same. And so now it's become a distraction. I don't know. I don't know what I would do if I came up with a character and had my dad's name. That would be really tough. Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, it's weird. Henry it's never been my name. I've never thought of it as mine, but it is my dad's. But by the time I was into the book, it was so separate from that, from him, that it didn't, it wasn't distracting me. But I didn't want to have to explain it to other people.
What did he think?
I don't think he's read the book. He hasn't said anything about it. He's just he's proud. He's a proud dad, but he's not really a bookish kind of guy, and probably hasn't read it. Oh my God,
that's so great. That's so lucky. Yeah. I know that sounds terrible, but it's just like the liberation of being able to write something and not worry about it.
Yeah. I know. I was a little worried, before the book came out, and I kind of gave them a little preview saying this is kind of what it's about, it's cool, everything's fine, don't worry about it.
It's a little racy. Yeah.
A little racy, yeah. But that aspect of it has been a lot less awkward than I thought it would be. I did the first like reading I did with the book was to a bookstore pretty much entirely full of my wife's family relatives.
Wow. No pressure at all.
No pressure, And so I was like, I'm going to read this super racy book about marital infidelity to all my in-laws. It's fiction.
Like something
cool.
Out of Sartre or something, this is the situation that you find yourself in.
Yeah. Yep. But they're totally cool. They've been super supportive. Although one of them did raise their hand and said, so, the character's name is Henry. Your name is Henry. Should we be reading into that? I was like, no, God, we've already talked about this. No.
There's gotta have one in every audience who's going to ask that question. Because even if the character's name isn't your name, people are always going to ask, is this you? Right.
Oh, yeah, of course. Right.
There's always that question.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I mean, I think that no is sort of the answer I always want to give. But but it never seems to satisfy, in that situation. It's like, well, yes, of course, everybody knows, write what you know. But then you're putting in your own experience, but in a completely different context. So it becomes an entirely new thing. I don't know. How do you handle questions like that?
Yeah, I mean, I do essentially just say no. I mean, this isn't, it's not me at all. But of course it's complicated because you create the character, and the character is coming from things that you imagine, and you have to sort of, pull from your own experience in creating characters. And what's more, this character, as I've said before, was kind of, I didn't want to completely create a character unlike myself from the ground up. And so I really did think of Henry as someone who, this would have been who I would have been if I had been born in the rural Georgia in that time period. I think we all make mistakes, and we're all, I'm not sort of embarrassed to talk about that and admit that like Henry's failings and who he is, there's a big part of me in there too. I didn't do any of these things, but I could imagine doing them, and that's different.
I think that's the whole point of fiction, though, is that you admit that you can imagine doing things, and then you're saying what if, and then playing it out. I mean, that's
Exactly.
the whole point, is like,
Yeah.
let's see what this would be like, and we don't have to
Exactly.
do it at all.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. And it's an empathic art form. It's the whole thing is based on empathy and based on identifying with another point of view. And that's where its power comes from. The questions or the comments about the book that have maybe annoyed me the most are when people say that they think the characters are all unlikable.
What?
Yeah, yeah, and my first response is really, like, I like all the characters. I think they're all likable. But secondly, it's like almost want to say, well, thank God you're perfect, right?
Right,
Like,
exactly.
I mean, these are more or less, every one of these characters, I believe, are more or less good people making bad decisions. And have you never made a bad decision? Like, or in a certain circumstance, are you telling me that you wouldn't do the same? What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. It's essentially what this where this book is. And I just it's shocking to me how people don't see people behaving poorly and judging them and not seeing themselves in it. It's amazing to me, that response. That hasn't been, that hasn't. I mean, not everyone reads it that way, of course, but I've been shocked about the number of people who have said, I don't like any of the characters, even though I love the book. I don't like any of the characters. I'm like, and also likability is the most boring way to judge a book anyway.
Yes.
Do you like Humbert Humbert? Do you like Raskolnikov? Like,
Yeah,
no.
do you want to hang out with them? Definitely not.
No. But they're amazing characters. Why would you judge a book or a character based on likability?
Yeah, I think this is a thing that seems to come up more recently. Maybe it's just me, of just like, are you allowed to have unlikable characters? And I don't even really understand what unlikable is, because there's plenty of, as you said, characters that I think are fantastic who I do not want in my personal life. Nor would I choose to be friends with them, but I definitely want to read about them. And I guess it sort of goes down to, what do you want to get out of reading?
Yeah.
Like, how far afield are you willing to go from your world and the way your world looks, or the way you want it to look?
Yes. Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. Yeah, because I think probably many people just want to be to affirm who they are, or affirm who they think they are and want to be, as opposed to read a viewpoint that is too different from theirs.
Yeah. Or something that I think in some ways people are like, I don't like these characters. It's like, maybe I would do this. I don't want to think about it.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. More to the point. Yeah.
Like, maybe I like them a little too much.
Exactly. Yeah.
But I think that's the whole process, is like, you get to know these characters better and better as you're writing the book and as you're revising the book, and you just know what they would do, and you have to follow through on it. You can't make it pretty or easy.
Right.
Especially not in literature, where you can really go for it. You can just say, yeah, this is what these people did. Wasn't necessarily pretty.
Yep.
And then we all get to learn from it. Well, I want to thank you so much for coming on again and talking more about the process of this book, which has been such a fascinating one to listen to, and the way that you wrote that draft and got to the book at the end of it. And I love knowing about the Secret History connection, actually.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. No, I hope this was helpful. I feel like I could talk all day about revision and different things that, ideas I had and all that stuff. But if you ever want to talk more about it, let me know.
Oh my God, anytime. But we'll just have to have you again.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. Well, and thank you so much. I'm so great talking to you.
Thank you so much for listening to the Secret Library podcast. We hope you've enjoyed this week's show. You can keep the conversation going by leaving a comment in the show notes at secretlibrarypodcast.com, or visit us on Facebook at facebook.com/secretlibrarypodcast. You can also connect directly with me on Twitter or Instagram, where I'm Caro Donahue. That's at CaroDonahue. I look forward to chatting with you there. See you next week. Until then, happy writing.